Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, I want to discuss the 17th century context for Paradise Lost. Now you might be thinking, what context is necessary? This is a story from Genesis that Milton is retelling. How is context relevant to this retelling of a very old story? Well, let me tell you, it's very relevant, and it has a lot to do with 17th century political struggles and problems that Milton was very, very intimately involved in. Okay, I'm going to move my head so you can see the beautiful long locks of Charles I. So, a huge, key, monumental event of the 17th century is the English Civil War. And it involves the Puritans. So, remember when we were reading Twelfth Night and Malvolio ends the play by saying, "I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you." Well, there's something kind of strangely prescient about that call for revenge because in the middle of the 17th century, the Puritans really do get their revenge in England. In fact, they shut down all the theaters when they take over, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I got to set the scene. So get comfortable, everyone. It's story time. I want to set the scene for the English Civil War. So we know who Elizabeth I is. We've talked about her a lot. She is replaced after she dies. She has no children. She's replaced by James I of Scotland. And then James I has a son, Charles I. This is where the trouble begins with this incipient English Civil War. Charles believes strongly in the divine right of kings, and he wishes to rule absolutely without limitations. In other words, you can't tell me what to do. I'm the king. God appointed me. You didn't appoint me, so don't tell me what to do. Everything's up to me. This is like Charles's MO, essentially. Well, Parliament, which is definitely a thing in the 17th century, it doesn't have all the powers it has today, but, it's still a body that has the power of taxation, etc. Parliament doesn't agree with this. And so there's increasing tension between Parliament, part of which is an elected body, and the king. Ultimately, after a long series of tensions, Charles often dissolves Parliament and tries to rule without them. It breaks out into civil war between these two factions, the parliamentarians, or sometimes they are referred to as the Republicans, and the royalists, or the supporters of King Charles. These are the two factions we're dealing with in the middle of the 17th century. Let's look a little bit more at what makes these two different from one another. Parliamentarians, as the title of this slide suggests, they tend to be Puritans. They tend to be religious Puritans. Royalists tend to be wealthy upper class, because like King Charles himself, the upper class are kind of royal in nature. Like they're born into their status, they hold a lot of privilege, so they kind of see their own privilege at stake here. So they kind of side with the royalist side to protect their own wealth and privilege and power. They also tend to include Anglicans, which is the Church of England, as well as those with Catholic sympathies. King Charles had a Catholic wife, which was still pretty scandalous in England, post-Protestant Reformation. The parliamentarians, they want to establish a new government with no monarch and no House of Lords, which is the aristocratic chamber of government. Basically, a more democratically elected form of government. They're led by a general called Oliver Cromwell. He later becomes the ruler. And it also includes John Milton. So Milton is on the side of the parliamentarians, the Republicans, the Puritans. That's the side he's on. He's not on the side of the Royalists, which actually includes most 17th century poets that we associate with this time period. The Civil War ultimately ends with the victory of the Puritan parliamentarians. They win. And then many royalists flee to the continent during this time. But the Puritans arrest Charles I. They place him on trial, they convict him, and they execute him for treason. So they execute their living monarch. Well, there have been wars before between kings and people trying to take over, and kings have died that way. This has never happened in the history of England, in which a people has held its ruler accountable, placed him on trial, and executed him. I should move my head so you can see the full gory details of this woodcut of the beheading of Charles I. Okay, this is a big deal. After they execute Charles I, the Puritans take over. No more monarchy, no more King of England. Instead, it's the Commonwealth, ruled by Parliament and also the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. So Cromwell is still kind of like a kingly-ish figure during this time. Milton is appointed to the position of Secretary for Foreign Tongues. And while he's in that position, he also publishes many tracts and pamphlets for the Commonwealth. He was really a political writer, in addition to being a poet. He's both those things, but he wrote a lot of political writings. They include the Doctrine of Discipline of Divorce, which argued that divorce should be legalized, the Areopagitica. It argued that free speech should be legal, meaning like you should be able to print anything you want, even if it offends the king or the ruler. There shouldn't be any laws censoring that. After Charles is executed, he writes the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates, which defends their actions. And then even more explicitly, he writes Iconoclastes, which defends the execution of Charles I itself, that saying that this was absolutely justified by the people. And throughout the 1650s, he writes multiple defenses of the English Commonwealth for readers both in England and abroad. So Milton is incredibly pro-Commonwealth, pro this radical political movement, 100%. Unfortunately for Milton, this radical political movement is short-lived. Their leader, Oliver Cromwell, dies in 1658, and with him, a lot of the vision and momentum for the Commonwealth begins to die as well. So in 1660, there's a newly elected parliament, and they vote to restore power to the monarchy, essentially ending this whole Puritan Commonwealth experiment. And they invite the son of Charles I, Charles II, to return to England and to assume power in exchange for giving Parliament more power and legalizing free speech. So this whole movement is over. The English Commonwealth is dead. And as you can imagine, Milton is not pleased by this. He goes to jail, and he's not too keen on making nice with the new Restoration government. He's not ready to apologize, or pledge allegiance to this new regime. So he stays in jail until another friend of his, who also worked for the Puritans, Andrew Marvell. Marvell was better at kind of switching loyalties. He's like, okay, Puritans are gone. I better, pledge my loyalty to the new king, the new government, etc. He intervenes for Milton and gets him out of jail. So that was a pretty pivotal moment in Milton's life, that his friend got him out of jail and prevented him from spending the rest of his life there. Okay, so all of this political turmoil is in the background of Paradise Lost. And he writes Paradise Lost in the 1660s, after really the most exciting time of his life is over. This political experiment, this political revolution that he was involved with has risen and it has fallen. And here he is, older, disillusioned, devastated, and blind. He has lost his sight in the 1650s. So this is the Milton who is writing Paradise Lost, not the young revolutionary, but the older person who has kind of tried and failed, the revolutionary who has not ultimately succeeded. So I want to ask you, what does Paradise Lost, which is essentially a retelling of the fall of humankind, have to do with this intensely volatile political revolution and defeat that Milton invested much of his life into? That's not a question I can answer right now. It's going to be addressed in detail in the themes video, so be sure to tune in there to see how this political context is being manifested and expressed in Paradise Lost. Hey all, I almost forgot to address this very pressing question, what were they wearing? Now that we've jumped ahead in time, we're finally in a new fashion moment, and it's definitely worth addressing. So this is the Puritan look, the Puritan chic look in the 1650s in particular. You'll notice how plain it is. Remember how we talked about the plainness and simplicity that Protestants and Puritans especially valued, from the Protestant Reformation up to Malvolio, now into the 1650s in the 17th century. You can definitely see that in their clothing. There's just simply not very much ornamentation here at all. And we can see this in the women's outfits as well. As a point of comparison, you might want to compare it to the fashion trends of the Restoration, which happened after the 1650s. Notice how much more ornate everything is. Even those wide-brimmed hats are covered in feathers. And everything is kind of ruched and gathered together, including a bunch of puffy sleeves. You can see that on the women as well. Lots of feather, Lots of false hair, lots of puffy sleeves. This offers a kind of nice counterpoint, I think, of the values of Restoration Society versus kind of Puritan society, where we see, again, the kind of plainness of the dress. Although I'd do anything to have one of these hats. Okay, that's all I've got for the fashion.